The notice was taped to my barn door, flapping slightly in the evening breeze, its bold red letters demanding compliance with the neighborhood's neutral color policy. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, had struck again. I knew it was her before even reading the signature at the bottom. Karen demanded my barn be painted neutral colors, so I made it neon. A smirk crept onto my face as I traced the edges of the letter, the words practically dripping with condescension. Violating community aesthetic standards, she claimed, as if my deep red barn, standing proudly on my land for over a century, was some kind of threat to the fabric of the neighborhood. My fingers clenched around the paper, but I refused to let my anger dictate my next move. Karen wanted neutrality. She wanted compliance. Oh, she was going to get a response, just not the one she expected. I turned to the structure behind me, the old wood worn but still strong, and an idea took root in my mind, spreading like wildfire. If Karen wanted to control the color of my barn, I'd give her a shade so loud it would echo in her nightmares. I had dealt with Karen's interference before, but this was a new level of absurdity. My barn wasn't even visible from the main road unless someone really tried to look. But Karen always found a way. Ever since she became HOA president, she had been on a mission to mold the neighborhood into her version of perfection, one cookie-cutter house, beige fence, and soulless lawn at a time. She had fined my neighbor for hanging a colorful wind chime, sent letters about inappropriate lawn furniture to an elderly couple who had a single wooden bench under their oak tree, and once even tried to ban Halloween decorations, claiming they were visually disruptive. But this was personal. My barn was more than just a structure, it was history. My grandfather had built it, my father had maintained it, and now it stood as a symbol of everything Karen couldn't control. And she hated that. I didn't waste any time. The next morning, I made a trip into town and picked out the most vibrant, eye-searing neon paint I could find. Electric blue. Blazing orange. A shade of pink so intense it practically hummed under the store lights. The cashier raised an eyebrow as she rang me up, clearly amused. "Big project?" she asked. I just grinned. "You could say that." The drive back felt like an adrenaline rush, the cans rattling in the back of my truck like a drumroll leading up to the greatest spectacle this neighborhood had ever seen. As I pulled up to my property, I spotted Karen 3 houses down, pruning her perfectly symmetrical hedges. I knew she'd see it. I knew she'd react. And that was exactly the point. By noon, the first coat was on. My barn was transforming into a beacon of defiance, a neon masterpiece visible from the heavens. The sun hit the fresh paint and practically made the air around it glow. A deep satisfaction settled into my bones as I stepped back and admired my work. Karen wanted my barn to blend in. Now it would stand out so much that it would be impossible to ignore. And just as I expected, the moment I wiped my hands clean and took a sip of water, I heard the familiar, clipped footsteps marching toward my property. I turned slowly, savoring the moment, and there she was, Karen, HOA's self-proclaimed enforcer, standing rigid at the edge of my driveway, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched a clipboard so tightly I thought it might snap in half. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the barn as if trying to process the assault on her precious aesthetic. I could see the gears in her head turning, the outrage bubbling just beneath the surface, ready to explode. I took another leisurely sip of water, tilting my head slightly. "Something wrong, Karen?" Her lips parted, then pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. I knew this was only the beginning, and I was ready for whatever she had planned next. Karen's face twisted into something between disbelief and fury, her fingers gripping that clipboard like it was the last thing tethering her to reality. I could almost hear the calculations running in her mind, the frantic search for some obscure HOA rule she could wield against me. But nothing she had prepared could have accounted for this, a barn painted in neon shades so blinding that it practically radiated into the atmosphere. The electric blue wrapped around the sides, the fiery orange streaked across the roof, and that aggressive pink on the doors was enough to make the most rebellious graffiti artist feel outdone. Karen inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, her jaw tightening like a coiled spring ready to snap. I watched, waiting for her to regain her composure, because I knew she would. Karen was the type to never accept immediate defeat, no matter how obvious it was. She lived for control, thrived on bending others to her will, and this was a direct challenge to her authority. She finally moved, shoulders squared, heels clicking against the pavement as she stormed away, the rigid posture of someone who had just declared war in her head. I had seen it before, the way she took offense to anything that didn't fit into her perfect little vision of the neighborhood, the way she pushed until people either gave in or moved out. The problem was, I wasn't going anywhere. I had owned this land before she even set foot in this community, and I wasn't about to let her erase my history because it didn't match her curated version of suburbia. I went back to work, adding a second coat, ensuring that every inch of my barn was drenched in unapologetic color. The sun was starting to set when I stepped back again, sweat clinging to my skin, my arms aching but my satisfaction unshaken. The barn looked glorious, a beacon of everything Karen despised. The next morning, I woke to find a thick envelope wedged into my mailbox, the HOA's official letterhead staring back at me like a challenge. Inside, a violation notice awaited, filled with legal jargon about non-compliance with aesthetic regulations and a demand for immediate corrective action. At the bottom, Karen's signature stood bold and proud, as if she thought a few typed-up threats would be enough to break my resolve. But I had expected this. In fact, I had been counting on it. She wanted a fight, and I was more than willing to give her one. I walked back into my house, placed the notice on my kitchen counter, and calmly made a few phone calls. I knew my rights, and more importantly, I knew how HOA rules worked when challenged properly. Karen had built her reign of power on intimidation and fear, using loopholes and vague wording to keep people in line. But I had done my research, and I was ready to turn those very rules against her. By the afternoon, word had already spread. Neighbors stopped by under the guise of casual conversation, their eyes darting between the barn and the letter I left deliberately visible on my porch table. Some whispered their approval, amused by the audacity of it all, while others looked nervous, wary of getting on Karen's bad side. But one thing was clear, people were talking, and Karen hated when things spiraled out of her control. It wasn't long before I saw her again, this time accompanied by 2 HOA board members, both of whom looked significantly less eager to be part of whatever she was planning. She gestured wildly toward my barn, flipping through her notes, probably reciting every regulation she had ever memorized, but I stayed where I was, arms crossed, waiting for her to make her move. I knew exactly what she was trying to do, and I had no intention of making this easy for her. Karen's frustration was palpable, her sharp gestures slicing through the air as she rattled off rules to the 2 board members flanking her. They didn't share her enthusiasm, one kept shifting uncomfortably while the other avoided eye contact altogether. They had likely been dragged into this, forced to stand as her enforcers in a battle they didn't want to fight. But Karen thrived on authority, and she wasn't going to back down, not after the spectacle my barn had become. It had already drawn enough attention to disrupt her carefully maintained order, and that was something she simply couldn't tolerate. She flipped through her clipboard, pointing at different sections, no doubt emphasizing the so-called violations I had committed, but I stood firm. I had spent the morning going over the HOA's own regulations, highlighting every vague, contradicting, and exploitable loophole I could find. If Karen wanted a war of rules, she was about to get one. The letter she had sent demanded immediate action, threatening hefty fines and legal consequences if I didn't repaint the barn within a week. But nowhere in the HOA's guidelines did it explicitly state what defined a neutral color. The rules referenced community standards, a term so vague it could mean anything depending on interpretation. It was a gray area, a weakness in her argument that I was more than prepared to exploit. If she wanted to push this further, she would have to prove that my barn, on my private property, was somehow a legitimate disruption. And I knew Karen well enough to understand that she had no patience for prolonged battles. She thrived on quick victories, on people folding under the weight of her pressure. But I wasn't like the others who had given in to her demands. I wasn't going to cower or repaint my barn out of fear. I had time, patience, and the law on my side. She must have realized that intimidation alone wouldn't work because her expression shifted, her voice lowering, likely switching to a more reasonable tone in an attempt to make me feel like I was the problem. She had used this tactic before, starting with aggression, then pretending to be the voice of reason, hoping people would take the path of least resistance. But I wasn't interested in negotiating with someone who only cared about control. I let her speak, let her list out every so-called issue my barn presented, knowing that she was trying to set a trap, but I refused to step into it. The two board members exchanged glances, their hesitance growing as Karen continued, her voice rising with each word. They hadn't expected me to stay silent, to let her unravel in her own frustration, but that was exactly what I wanted. Karen was at her most reckless when she felt ignored, when she sensed that her power wasn't having the immediate effect she wanted. And sure enough, she snapped. Her composure cracked, her voice sharpening as she threatened legal action, claiming that she would escalate this to the highest level of the HOA. The board members flinched at her outburst, realizing just how personal this had become for her. I saw the moment doubt crept into their expressions, the recognition that this wasn't about the barn or the rules, it was about Karen's inability to accept defiance. They had likely seen her pull this before, but now, with more neighbors watching from a distance, with whispers traveling faster than she could contain them, her iron grip over the community was slipping. She turned on her heel, her fury barely restrained as she stormed away, the two board members reluctantly following, neither looking convinced that this was a battle worth fighting. I watched her leave, knowing this wasn't over. Karen didn't know how to lose gracefully, and she would be back, armed with more threats, more fabricated violations, anything to force me into submission. But she had underestimated just how prepared I was. I had already contacted a lawyer, already gathered the necessary evidence, already begun reaching out to other homeowners who had suffered under her rule. The moment she chose to escalate this, she would find herself in a far bigger fight than she had ever anticipated. As the sun cast its final light on my brilliantly painted barn, its neon colors glowing defiantly against the dimming sky, I smiled. Karen thought she was dealing with just another rule-breaker. She had no idea that she had just picked a fight with someone who wasn't afraid to take this all the way. The next morning, the fallout from Karen's failed confrontation had already begun spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. The usual hush of early suburban life had been replaced by murmurs and stolen glances, neighbors pausing by their mailboxes a little longer, whispering in tight circles on driveways, their eyes flicking between my barn and Karen's pristine beige home down the street. I knew this was exactly what she had feared the most, loss of control, the cracks in her perfect image spreading faster than she could contain them. It wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about the years of suppressed resentment, the silent frustrations of every homeowner who had ever felt the weight of her arbitrary rules pressing down on them. And now, with my neon barn standing loud and defiant, it was as if an unspoken permission had been granted. People were starting to realize that they didn't have to fall in line. By mid-afternoon, another official HOA notice arrived at my doorstep, this time thicker, heavier, a desperate escalation disguised as legal jargon. Karen had compiled an exhaustive list of supposed violations, stretching back months, cherry-picking anything she could possibly use against me. Some were laughably minor, claims that my grass had been slightly over HOA-mandated length, accusations that my driveway contained excessive dust buildup, even a complaint about the color of my mailbox, which had remained unchanged for years. It was obvious what she was trying to do. She was throwing everything she had at me, hoping something would stick, hoping I would break under the sheer volume of nonsense regulations she was attempting to enforce all at once. But this only confirmed what I had already suspected. Karen was losing her grip, and she was getting desperate. I took my time reading through each absurd violation, making notes, highlighting contradictions, piecing together a counterargument Karen wouldn't be able to ignore. Then, just as I expected, she appeared again, this time with an entire entourage. A full lineup of HOA board members trailed behind her, some hesitant, others visibly exhausted, clearly aware that they were being pulled into something far messier than they had signed up for. Karen led the charge, her expression steeled, her polished heels clicking against the pavement with renewed determination. This wasn't just about a barn anymore, this was a personal crusade, a battle she refused to lose, not because she believed in the rules, but because she believed in her own absolute authority. She needed to win, needed to prove that her word was still law, and that was exactly why she had already lost. She presented the violations as if reading a final verdict, her voice laced with forced composure, but I could hear the underlying strain. The board members stood behind her, shuffling awkwardly, none of them looking particularly eager to enforce the list of petty complaints. A few even glanced toward the barn with something that almost resembled amusement, as if recognizing how ridiculous this had all become. But Karen continued, her speech rehearsed, her determination unwavering, as if she believed that saying the words with enough force would make them true. But she hadn't accounted for the fact that I had come prepared. I reached for the folder I had assembled the night before, flipping it open to the very HOA guidelines she had so eagerly cited, now marked and annotated to expose every contradiction, every vague definition, every loophole she had used against homeowners for years. The rules she had weaponized were now being used against her, her own authority crumbling under the weight of her overreach. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend myself. The documents spoke for themselves, and the board members knew it. Karen, for all her confidence, was unraveling, realizing too late that she had overplayed her hand. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken tension, until finally, one of the board members hesitated, shifting uncomfortably before speaking in a careful, measured tone. It was the first crack in Karen's defenses, and I watched as the others followed, murmuring among themselves, acknowledging the validity of my counterpoints, questioning whether these violations were enforceable at all. Karen's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists, her control slipping through her grasp like sand. She tried to push back, but the momentum had already shifted. The power she had wielded so effortlessly was no longer absolute, and she knew it. As the board deliberated, I saw the realization dawn on her, the slow, creeping horror of understanding that she had backed herself into a corner with no way out. And then, just as expected, she did what all tyrants do when faced with the inevitability of their downfall, she refused to accept it. With a final, sharp inhale, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving the board to clean up the mess she had created. But I knew she wasn't finished. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, not quietly, not with grace. She would find another way, another angle, another desperate attempt to claw back her control. But she had made one fatal mistake, she had underestimated just how much fight I had left in me. The silence Karen left in her wake was heavier than any argument she could have made. The board members lingered awkwardly, exchanging uneasy glances, clearly aware that they had just been abandoned in the middle of a battle they weren't prepared to fight. The tide had turned, and they knew it. The neighborhood had seen Karen falter, had watched as she lost her composure, and now the power she once held was slipping. I didn't need to celebrate or press the advantage, the damage to her authority had already been done. The whispers would spread, and soon, even those who once blindly followed her would start questioning whether she was worth defending. I closed my folder and turned my attention back to the barn, the neon colors even more striking under the late afternoon sun, as if mocking the very concept of conformity. But I knew Karen wasn't finished. She had retreated, but it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She would regroup, rethink, and return with something even more aggressive. 2 days later, the retaliation arrived in the form of a legal notice. A cease and desist order, drafted with exaggerated claims of property devaluation, citing a section of the HOA rules that referenced community harmony. It was weak, and Karen had to know it. There was nothing in the official regulations that dictated specific color palettes, nothing that explicitly gave the HOA the right to demand repainting unless it fell under structural disrepair. But Karen was counting on intimidation, banking on the idea that legal threats alone would be enough to make me back down. She had underestimated how far I was willing to go. I made a call to my lawyer, who barely stifled a laugh after reviewing the letter, confirming what I already knew. It was full of empty threats, an attempt to manipulate rather than enforce. If Karen wanted a legal fight, I was more than happy to give her one. The escalation didn't stop there. Karen knew she had lost control over the HOA board, so she took the battle to the neighborhood itself, spreading carefully crafted rumors. I was being difficult on purpose, she claimed, trying to turn the community against me, warning that my defiance would lead to further chaos, that if people didn't stand with the HOA, the neighborhood would descend into disorder. But the cracks in her influence were already showing. The problem with ruling through fear was that once people saw weakness, they started questioning everything. The same homeowners she had bullied for years were now remembering their own grievances, their own fines, their own frustrations. I started noticing small changes, a few more people leaving garden decorations out a little longer than before, a neighbor down the street replacing his dull beige shutters with a deep shade of green. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. Karen, of course, wasn't ready to accept that. She needed to reassert her authority, to prove that she still had control, and so she took her last and most desperate step yet. A formal petition, urging the HOA to amend its regulations, proposing a strict set of aesthetic rules that would require prior approval for any exterior modifications, including paint colors. It was a blatant attempt to retroactively create a rule that would target my barn specifically, a last-ditch effort to rewrite the game after realizing she had no way to win under the existing ones. The petition made its way to my mailbox along with every other household in the neighborhood, carefully worded to sound reasonable, to appeal to those who wanted order over conflict. But Karen had miscalculated again. She had assumed the community would rally behind her, that they would see my defiance as the true problem. But what she failed to understand was that people were tired. Tired of her rules, tired of the fines, tired of the endless restrictions that made their own homes feel like anything but their own. The day of the HOA vote, the atmosphere was different. There was no hushed reverence, no fearful compliance. Homeowners arrived with their own stories, their own frustrations, their own quiet rebellion brewing beneath the surface. Karen stood at the front, poised and polished, making her case with the same carefully measured authority she had always relied on. But this time, the murmurs in the crowd weren't of agreement, they were of skepticism, of exhaustion, of defiance. One by one, people started raising questions, pointing out inconsistencies, questioning why their homes should be dictated by rules that seemed to exist only for the sake of control. Karen pushed back, but for the first time, she was met with resistance she couldn't silence. And then, the vote was counted, and her petition failed. The look on Karen's face was worth every hour I had spent fighting. For years, she had ruled unchecked, her power absolute, her word law. But now, in the face of overwhelming rejection, there was nothing left for her to do but accept what she had fought so hard to prevent. Her grip on the neighborhood had shattered, and she knew it. I turned toward my barn, standing vibrant and unapologetic in the distance, and felt the weight of victory settle over me. Karen had tried to force neutrality, to erase individuality, to mold the world into a version that suited her vision. But she had failed. And now, for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who actually lived in it. Karen's defeat was not just a loss in a vote, it was the unraveling of her authority, the crumbling of a carefully constructed reign built on fear and manipulation. She had spent years ensuring that no one questioned her, that every rule she imposed was accepted without resistance, but now, the illusion of her control had shattered beyond repair. The petition's failure had been a public rejection, a neighborhood-wide statement that people were done being dictated to, and she had no way to spin it in her favor. For the first time, Karen had no response, no countermeasure, no backup plan. The very people she had relied on to enforce her will were now questioning her leadership, and that was a loss she could not afford. The days that followed were tense but revealing. Karen retreated into damage control, sending out carefully worded emails attempting to reframe the situation, insisting that she only had the neighborhood's best interests in mind, but the words felt empty now. Homeowners who had once feared crossing her were suddenly emboldened, and it showed in the small yet significant ways they pushed back. Decorations that would have previously been taken down overnight remained up without consequence, fences were repainted in colors beyond the HOA's suggested palette, and driveways were no longer meticulously cleared of minor imperfections Karen once deemed unacceptable. My barn, in all its neon glory, had become more than just a statement. It had become a symbol of defiance, a reminder that Karen's rules only held power if people allowed them to. It wasn't long before whispers of a recall vote surfaced, quiet at first, but growing steadily as more homeowners began to acknowledge what they had tolerated for too long. People were starting to talk, to share their grievances openly, realizing that the power Karen had wielded was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. The fines, the citations, the restrictions, all of it had been built on the assumption that no one would challenge her. And now that they had, the foundation beneath her authority was crumbling. When the official recall petition appeared, signatures poured in faster than even Karen could have anticipated. She tried to fight back, to discredit the movement, but the momentum was too strong. The same board members she had once commanded were now distancing themselves, unwilling to go down with her. The night of the final vote, the community center was packed with homeowners who had once felt powerless under Karen's rule but now stood together with quiet determination. She arrived looking as polished as ever, her expression composed, but the tension in her posture betrayed the storm beneath the surface. She gave one last speech, an attempt to regain control, to convince people that she was still the leader they needed, but the words lacked conviction. No one was listening anymore. The vote was swift, the outcome decisive. Karen was removed from her position, her reign officially over. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. Karen's departure was quiet, almost anticlimactic, a stark contrast to the iron grip she had once held. Within a week, a moving truck was parked in her driveway, and by the next, she was gone, her pristine beige house standing empty, a relic of a failed dictatorship. The relief that swept through the neighborhood was almost tangible, and the changes came quickly. The HOA was restructured, the excessive fines revoked, and for the first time in years, people were allowed to enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary enforcement. My barn remained untouched, standing bold and vibrant as ever, a permanent reminder of what had been won. The final irony came when property values, which Karen had so passionately claimed were being destroyed by my neon barn, actually rose in the months following her removal. Without the oppressive fines and restrictions, new families were eager to move in, drawn by the newfound sense of community rather than fear of enforcement. What Karen had spent years trying to suppress had been the very thing that made the neighborhood thrive. The HOA still existed, but now it worked for the residents rather than against them, ensuring fairness rather than control. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting warm hues over the landscape, I stood outside, taking in the quiet contentment that had settled over the neighborhood. A few houses down, a family laughed as they painted their front door a shade of deep red, something Karen never would have allowed. Across the street, an elderly couple placed garden gnomes along their flower beds, smiling without worry of a fine arriving in their mailbox. The small victories, the acts of defiance, had transformed into something greater, a community that had reclaimed its freedom. My barn, glowing in its unapologetic neon brilliance, was a testament to everything that had happened, to the fight that had been worth every struggle. Karen had tried to enforce neutrality, to erase individuality, to mold the neighborhood into her vision of perfection, but in the end, all she had done was show people how much they had to lose by staying silent. She had built a system designed to make people fall in line, and in doing so, she had created the very thing that led to her downfall. And as I leaned against my truck, looking over the land that had stood in my family for generations, I knew one thing for certain: this was exactly the kind of victory that even Karen, wherever she was now, could never repaint.